All right, back with another playoff predictor video. I should mention at the top, because I think there's been some confusion as to what this video is. This is less about me giving my predictions as to what I really think is going to happen. In fact, there are times when a team that I have in a specific spot, I actually think probably won't end up on that list, such as when I had the Broncos not making the playoffs last week, despite the fact that I felt pretty confident they end up getting there. This is more about just looking at situations and looking at, what each team has to do to make the playoffs and to get the seeding that they want to get. So, yeah, without further ado, let's just jump into it. Starting off with the AFC. You see right here, I do now have the Broncos in the playoffs, which again, I'm sure will make Broncos fans happy. They were not thrilled with me last week when they saw Miami in that 7th spot. We'll talk about what they have to do to make sure they get in, but I felt pretty good they were going to get in even last week. Definitely feel pretty good now. We'll talk about what changed. First, you see Chiefs are still the 1 seed, Bills 2 seed, Steelers 3 seed, Texans 4 seed. It's kind of been that way for a while. Is worth noting the Steelers played a Ravens, so if those 2 seeds could essentially flip if that game goes the other way. But let's start off with the 1 seed. Let's talk about that first. So you see the Chiefs' schedule. For the first time since doing these, I have a projected loss for the Kansas City Chiefs, and it's one that takes some explaining. So I have the Broncos projected to beat the Chiefs now. The reasoning is because of where the Chiefs are at for the 1 seed. If they win the next 3 games, they've clinched the 1 seed. I think they then probably maybe play their starters for a half or rest their starters, in which case I'm giving the edge to Denver. So because of that, that is their projected loss. Now, if they lose one of the first 3 games, they might not have that 1 seed clinched, and then that game maybe flips to a projected win, which is where things get interesting and why this is so difficult to do. But again, it's more about what each team has to do. The Chiefs win your next 3, you got the 1 seed. The Steelers, who are the next team that I want to talk about, even though I project them to get the 3 seed, because I think they have the easiest pathway to get the 1 seed, because they play Kansas City. So they can make sure Kansas City doesn't win their next 3 if they can get a victory there. And if Denver is playing for a wild card spot week 18, well, that makes things makes things tougher for the Chiefs. Maybe they lose that game and you can find a way to get the 1 seed. However, of course, one of the biggest issues for the Steelers is they have to win out here. So they have to beat the Eagles, the Ravens, and the Chiefs, and then the Bengals. That's going to be, 3 games that they might be underdogs in. They'll be favorites against the Bengals. They should be favorites against the Ravens, I think. I project them to win that game. But seems like it's a tough pathway, but still, it is not. You're not out of it if you're the Steelers. As for the Bills, I do have a scheduled loss on their resume. Even if they win that game and go 4-0, if the Chiefs just go 3-1, they still end up with the division, with the 1 seed, excuse me. So you might think, okay, well, not the biggest deal in the world. That game still does matter, though, because if the Bills can win that game and the Chiefs lose any of their, if they go 2-2 down the stretch, that puts the Bills in, even if one of those Chiefs losses is to the Steelers, because I have the Steelers losing to the Eagles next week. So for if the Steelers are able to if the Steelers are able to win out, then they have the 1 seed as long as the Chiefs lose another game. But if the Steelers don't win out but do beat the Chiefs, or if the Chiefs just lose another game, they can still get the 1 seed. So if you're a Bills fan, you need a Steelers loss and you need 2 Chiefs losses, and then you need to win out to get the 1 seed. Need a lot, but not impossible. Now let's go over to the entire conference. So we're going to talk about some divisional situations and some wild card situations. It's actually pretty complex here with the AFCs, so bear with me. We're going to spend a minute talking about some of these teams. The first, I think the other division that we have to talk about is the AFC South. The AFC North, I kind of touched on it. If the Ravens beat the Steelers, everything else holds. Ravens win the division. Not going to get too, can't have this video take forever. Can't discuss every little seeding difference, really focusing on what could affect playoffs, and the AFC South could affect playoffs. Again, this is the Texans' projected schedule. I have them going 1-3. Now, they beat Miami. They're good. They don't even have to sweat it out. If they don't, then they play Kansas City and Baltimore. I don't think it's crazy at all to say that they could be 8-8 heading into that final game. Now, the way I have it projected is if they win the final game, that would still be enough because they're not in a very strong division. Really, their biggest threat is the Indianapolis Colts. You look at the Colts schedule, I have the one projected loss to the Denver Broncos next week. I have them, I mean, they're playing probably the three worst teams in football after that, the Titans, Giants, and Jaguars. If the Colts pull off a victory, I think they're kind of in the driver's seat for the division, as crazy as that sounds, because of the tough Houston schedule, unless Houston can also beat Miami. But if it goes the way that it could go next week, which is if the Colts can win and they get a Texans loss, the way I have it projected would be the Colts would get the 4 seed, the Texans would be out of the playoffs, the Broncos would still get the 7 seed, although it's a little bit too close for comfort at that point for Denver, because one more loss and they'd be in trouble. So that's the divisional side of things. We got to talk about the wild card, because there's a ton of teams that could be a wild card team. First, let's talk about who could be threats to not be a wild card team, who could be out of it, who's currently in as a wild card team. First, let's look at the Chargers, who I have going 4-0, actually, down the stretch, because they play the Buccaneers, the Broncos, the Patriots, and the Raiders. The good news for the Chargers is the way I have everything set up, all they have to do is go 2-2, and they would be in. If they lose to the Bucs and Broncos, but then beat the Patriots and Raiders, that's enough. They're still in. The exception is if one of the wild card contending teams overperforms, but as of right now, that would be enough. As for the Baltimore Ravens, who I do have a projected loss on their schedule to the Steelers, 3-1 would be enough, and again, 2-2 would be enough. If they lose to the Texans on Week 17, that would still be enough, as long as they take care of business against the Giants and the Browns. So they're also in a pretty good spot here. Really, I do have to go back to the Denver Broncos, who I think they're the team that is the most vulnerable here due to their schedule. I don't think they have a single game you say is a guaranteed victory. Colts, Chargers, Bengals, and Chiefs. I only have them projected to lose one of those games, but again, projections are just projections. They can change easily. I'm obviously going to be wrong about stuff. So how do they make sure they get into the playoffs? Well, this is how. Go 3-1. You're almost certainly in. I think they would actually be clinched in if they go 3-1. So how does this team get knocked out of the playoffs? Well, actually, 2 games this week could create a disaster scenario for the Broncos, which would be, first, if they lose to the Colts. They need to beat the Colts. That's a huge game. Like I said, if they lose and everything else holds, they still would make the playoffs, but it's a big game. They really want to win that one. If they lose to the Colts, and if the Texans beat the Dolphins, it's interesting because the Dolphins and Broncos seemingly were the 2 teams fighting for the playoff spot, but if the Texans, because of the way the Colts would now be propped up and probably win the division, if the Texans also won, that would put them at 10 wins. The Broncos would be out of the postseason. Texans win the division, Colts get the 7 seeds. So those 2 things can flip. So while I still think Denver feels okay about their odds, there is ways this can absolutely go wrong. They have to be careful here, quite frankly. The other way things could go horribly wrong is if if they lose to the Colts, and then let's say the Chiefs do play their starters the final game of the season, they go 1-3, they would be out. I have Miami then getting in. And the other thing is Miami actually has a way to get better than I'm projecting them. So this is Miami's schedule. I for the longest time had kind of had them going undefeated, but again, I think it's kind of confusing people because I wasn't saying that I think that they're a good enough team to go 5-0. I was really just saying I kind of I'm leaning towards them winning each of the games they happen to have down the stretch. I think now I'm leaning towards 49ers beating the Dolphins. So listen, Dolphins are in a tough spot. I think they probably have to win out. I think they probably don't. They probably drop a game here or there. If they win out, though, all they would need is Denver to go 2-2 in their 4 games. Like I said, they play the Chargers, who that's a projected loss. They have the Colts, the Bengals, and the Chiefs. Those are definitely losable games. So if you're a Dolphins fan, you don't feel like you're out of it whatsoever. So that's the other way that Denver could lose. So Denver, in a weird way, almost wants the Dolphins to win next week, but then they have to lose some other games if they're going to get into the playoffs. So they're in the driver's seat, but they have to take care of business the final month of the season. Finally, as for the Indianapolis Colts, who could be a wild card contender as well, so just kind of throwing that out there. Let's say the Texans actually kind of get back on track and win a couple games, and they're easily in the division. How do the Colts then get a wild card spot? Because that's the other thing. I think their easiest pathway might be to win the division, but there is still the way that, like I said, if the Texans can pull out a victory, can the Colts get into the playoffs? Well, you see their schedule projected to beat 3 of the 4 teams they play, the not very good teams, but then lose to the Broncos. yes, if they go 4-0, that's enough. They're in. They're in the playoffs if they go 4-0. So huge win next week if they can get it. They're probably in the playoffs because they still have to take care of business those other 3 weeks, but they feel great about it if they can pull off the what probably will be an upset against the Denver Broncos, but we'll see. So huge game coming up for both of those two teams, but especially Indianapolis. And to be clear, even if Miami wins out, they would still get in. The Colts would still get into the wild card spot. So they control their own destiny here, but got to take care of business. Can they go 4-0? We'll see. Now let's move over to the NFC. You see a lot of similar faces. 6 out of the 7 teams remain the same. The difference, the Rams I now have winning the division, interestingly enough. So the Seahawks, who pull off this big victory against the Cardinals, essentially put the nail in their coffin, all of a sudden have another animal they got to worry about in the Los Angeles Rams. We'll talk about them in a second. First, let's just go to the 1 seed. So there are really 3 players for the 1 seed. First, the Lions, of course, who currently have it. You see their schedule, they're in a pretty good spot. I mean, they win 4 in a row, they get the 1 seed. If they lose a game, they still get the 1 seed. If they lose to the Buffalo Bills, that's fine. They would still have the 1 seed. So if they lose a different game, they could end up losing the tiebreaker. The way I had it last week was if they lost an NFC game, then they would lose the tiebreaker and therefore lose the 1 seed. Now that has flipped, and now the way I have it working is, the Lions would get a tiebreaker. So it's very, it's a bit up in the air. But realistically, the Lions, all they have to do is, even if they lose to the Bills, just take care of business against the Bears, the 49ers, and the Vikings. They get the 1 seed. That is no guarantee, and that Bills game still will matter because I actually think the Vikings are in a unique spot here. Because you see the Vikings schedule, I have them going 3-1 with victories over the Bears, Seahawks, and Packers, which are no guarantees. But if they can pull off those 3 victories, I have them losing to the Lions. I think that's probably the most likely outcome. Lions get the 1 seed. If Detroit loses against Buffalo next week, that game would be for the 1 seed, not just for the division, for the 1 seed. If the Vikings win, they would get the 1 seed. So even if the Eagles win out. So that's very fascinating to me and a very interesting situation that could end up happening. That could be the Sunday night game. We've seen that before when the 49ers and Seahawks played each other on the final game of the season for the 1 seed. Sometimes it happens. We'll see if that's what happens there. The Eagles, who, they can win out. I think the Steelers and Commanders are no guarantees, but I do have them projected to win out. How do they get into the 1 seed, though? What's their pathway there? Well, I actually think, weirdly, the easiest pathway might be if the Lions lose one of their NFC games and then they get the strength of schedule tiebreaker, but that's a really difficult thing to pull off. So first, you got to win out is what you have to do if you're the Eagles. And then what I think you need is a Vikings loss somewhere. So if you get the Vikings to lose to Seattle or to Green Bay, that could be helpful because then if you can win out, it could be a scenario where the Vikings have a chance to still get the 1 seed if they win the final game and the Eagles lose the final game. Realistically, though, I think the Vikings might rest their starters. I actually think the Eagles are in a pretty tough spot to get the 1 seed. I think their easiest pathway is the Lions, drop multiple games, of course. That's kind of what they need. And they might need the Lions to drop to the Bills and the 49ers or something like that. And then the Seahawks, lose, the Vikings lose another game as well. Despite the fact that I think the Eagles probably end up as the 2 seed, I think it's a little bit more difficult for them to get the 1 seed because they don't play the Lions again this season. Or they don't play them at all this season. So that's probably why I have them there. As for the rest of the conference, you see where every team is right here. So you see some of the players, and there's a. I mean, this is very complex. What's going to go on? So let's start with some divisions. Let's start with just the easiest one, the NFC South, just because we can kind of knock that out quickly. It's relatively simple with the Buccaneers and the Falcons, the 2 players here. The Buccaneers are in the driver's seat right now. They have taken the lead in the division, which is something that we kept projecting and kept wondering, is something going to go horribly wrong? So far, that answer is no. They're now projected to lose next week against the Chargers, and then they're projected to beat the Cowboys, Panthers, and Saints. If they win those 3 games, they are probably going to be into the playoffs. There is a very small way that if the Rams and Seahawks both do very well, one of those teams could get the 7 seed and the Falcons could win the division. But realistically, they go 3-1, they're in. They go 4-0, it's guaranteed. They control their own destiny here. The Atlanta Falcons also are projected to go 3-1. Again, play the Panthers just like the Buccaneers do. Couple get-right games against the Raiders and the Giants. And then the Commanders game, which could be such a big game because the Commanders might need that win as well. I'm leaning towards Washington right now. We'll see how that goes. But essentially for Atlanta, it's simple enough. Tampa Bay probably is going to lose against the Chargers. Go 4-0, win the division. No one's talking about how bad the Kirk Cousins contract is if you can do that. So still very much possible. That's the division situation for those two teams. They both have a wild card shot as well. That's for the division. Heading over to the Rams, who again, that's kind of the big surprise that you might see is they're projected to get the 4 seed. I should mention, I think for all of these teams we're talking about in the NFC West and NFC South, the division probably is the easiest way to get into the playoffs. The Rams, I actually even have them losing to Seattle the final game of the season, but I have them beating the 49ers, Jets, and Cardinals. 49ers game is just in a few days. If they can pull this off, I do have them, winning the division. So why does just 3-1 and even losing to Seattle, why is that enough? Well, if you look at the Seahawks schedule, you see they play Green Bay and Minnesota the next 2 games of the season. Then they play the Bears and the Rams. All that the Seahawks need to do is upset one of those 2 games or get a Rams loss in one of the next 3 games, and it'll all come down to that final game of the season, which how fun would that be if that is the case? I think that's what probably happens. I think Seattle probably steals a game here or the Rams drop one here. But, they got to figure it out. It's tough for Seattle because the Rams beating the Bills, we're all talking about how great Seattle would be, how great of shape Seattle would be if they can beat the Cardinals. We just didn't expect that kind of other shoe to drop, and the Rams beating the Bills now all of a sudden puts them a bit in the driver's seat right here. As for Arizona, it's a bit tough, but they're not dead yet, actually. In fact, there's a way where if only 2 games flip, they would get in. First, they have to go 4-0. I'm projecting them to go 3-1. They have to beat the Rams down the stretch. They go 4-0. Okay, they're back in the not in driver's seat, but they're back in it, so to speak. That would put them at 10 wins. The interesting thing, and the way that they get into the playoffs is if the Rams then lose, or the Rams then win the final game of the season. So the Rams are projected to lose to the Seahawks the final game of the season. For Cardinals, you go 4-0, you get the Seahawks to go 1-3, then that's how you get in because you beat the Rams. It's possible. I don't know if that's going to happen. They really needed to win this game, but you're not out of it yet. It's not fair to say that they are completely dead, but they need help here. They just do. Even 4-0 would not be enough. They need some help along with it. Going over to the 49ers, who I'm projecting to lose 3 different games. Also, we'll still talk about them. They're in a really tough spot. First, they have to win out. So they have to beat the Rams, Cardinals, Lions, and Dolphins. I don't think any are guarantees, and I think they're going to be underdogs in several of those games. If they can go 4-0, it still does not get them in. They need some help on top of it. So Seattle would then get into the playoffs with 10 wins. Even if the Seahawks lose that final game and the Rams win it, then the Rams would get in with 10 wins. So they need some unique help. It's not only do they need teams in front of them to lose games, they need to lose the right games. Now, the way I have everything set up, the easiest pathway in, they win every game. If the Seahawks lose their next 3, meaning they lose to the Bears as well, that could also be enough. Or the Rams drop a couple non-divisional games. You still have to deal with the Cardinals, who could be a threat. Again, they played each other the final game of the season, so it's a weird scenario, quite frankly, for the 49ers to get in. But you keep winning, you keep it alive. Hope you can make something happen that way. They need a lot to happen. Finally, let's talk about the Washington Commanders, so they're the 7th seed right now, and it feels like the simple thing is they just win enough games to maintain the 7th seed, and then, every other team is trying to get in through the division, right? Commanders, I currently have projected to have a better record than either of the division winners in the South or the West. But what if something goes haywire? Well, the way I have everything currently set up, even if the Commanders lose to the Saints or the Cowboys, they're fine. Lose to the Eagles, beat the Falcons, you're into playoffs with 2-2 down the stretch, being 10 wins gets them in. If they lose to Atlanta, that's where things get tough because that bumps Atlanta up into the NFC South champions, meaning that Tampa Bay and Washington each have 10 wins. Tampa Bay beat Washington earlier in the season. Tampa Bay gets into the playoffs. Washington would be out there. So really, Washington's in an okay spot as long as they take care of business. The one X factor, though, is if they lose to the Saints or the Cowboys and they lose to the Eagles and still beat the Falcons, let's say they lose the next two, win the final two, they probably are fine. The only thing is if Seattle and LA both go on a run and end up with 11 wins, that would then knock them out. They have the tiebreaker over those teams. So even if you're all 10-10, you're fine. You just got to make sure you beat Atlanta. That's probably the biggest pathway for them to be out of the playoffs, in which case Tampa Bay still gets in and Atlanta gets in. That would be what happens there. If Tampa Bay falls off a cliff and you lose to the Atlanta Falcons, well, then there is a way that, again, Seattle or the Rams could both get in, perhaps. But realistically, beat the Falcons and you're probably okay. So, yeah, very complex thing. We can do the draft order at the end. You see the draft order here. I think I had the Jaguars winning a couple games. I don't know why. Maybe that was just me being stupid. I don't know. But you have the Giants projected to actually get the 1 seed. It's interesting because currently the Raiders are in line for the first overall pick. I mean, not 1 seed. Currently the Raiders are in line for that, but it'll probably come down to strength of schedule. I had the strength of schedule flipping, and then the Giants would get it. So that's interesting. Patriots, the Titans, Browns, Panthers. So those are the rest of the teams. But yeah, interesting there for those who are fascinated about that stuff. But yeah, I mean, again, really complex. I'm looking forward to hopefully things get a little bit simpler in the following weeks when there's just less going on, but still a lot of teams alive right now in several ways they can get in. And weirdly, it tends to be through the division, not through the wild card, especially in the NFC. So yeah, interesting, but those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.